everyone. Welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Sana Maqbool, with you at PTV WORLD. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two very important stories. The first story is with reference to what is happening around the world, in particular reference to the impact that the Ukrainian crisis had on the food crisis around the world, how it's affecting economies, especially the developing world as well, and how it's leading to a food crisis. Have been a lot of concerns that have been shared since this crisis took place earlier, and now there have been statements coming in from Food and Agriculture Organization, other bodies of the UN around the world as well, highlighting how the impact of the Ukrainian crisis, the blockade of the Black Sea region, is affecting the food crisis and how it's going to affect the developing nation the most, who's already recovering from the impact of COVID-19 and climate change, among others as well. So this is, of course, an issue of global concern, and we're going to talk about what needs to be done with reference to avert this crisis, or at least help the people who are going to be suffering, who still are suffering due to this crisis, and who really is to blame for it and what can be done about it. In our second segment, we will be taking a look at Pakistan and China's relations under the new government. We know that earlier Shehbaz Sharif and his government back in 2015 has initiated CPEC as well, and this was important for Pakistan and has been a game changer for the country. However, there has been a lot of issues with regards to the progress of CPEC projects as well. They haven't had the kind of fast tracking that was needed. In line, we also heard that there has been issues with CPEC authority as well, and how the new planning minister, Maqbool, has instructed for the CPEC authority to be abolished, calling it a redundant organization with huge waste of resources. How that is going to help boost up the speed at which the CPEC projects are going to be fulfilled, we'll put that under question. And then, of course, the renewed commitment that Shehbaz Sharif's government is going to have towards China and related projects as well. In the meantime, we also know that security concerns were also one of the reasons why CPEC projects got delayed previously as well. An unfortunate incident has also happened in Karachi, where 3 Chinese nationals have been targeted and lost their lives, including their Pakistani driver as well. And this has been a cause of major concern. The separatist groups, militants who targeted the Chinese nationals, attacked them as part of a university. And this, of course, is highly condemnable and quite unfortunate, and will definitely also be impacting the way we're going to see the future progress of CPEC projects well. So we'll look at that in our discussion as well. For our first segment, we've been joined in the studios, as always, by Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal, and online we've been joined by Professor Scott Lucas, who's a political analyst, and we've also been joined by Daria Platonova, who's a senior analyst. Thank you very much, both of you, for being with us in the debate today. Mr. Scott, I'll start with you. We've talked about the crisis in Ukraine a lot of times before as well, and tried to see how we can move towards perhaps a more peaceful resolution. We want to also look at the crisis now in terms of its global impact and the way it's going to affect economies and people around the world. This, of course, points towards the food crisis that's also looming, and the way that perhaps the poorest and most developing nations are going to get affected. This is something that has been spoken about, but in the past also we've seen that perhaps such humanitarian concerns don't really become a priority for organizations or countries. And there's a lot of blame going on. But what can really be done about it, or needs to be done for this food crisis to be addressed?
I'll take the easy part of the question first. To address the food crisis, Russia needs to stop the invasion. No invasion has just local effects. It has international effects. So in the last 2 months, what we've seen in an area, Russia and Ukraine, that provide 30% of the world's wheat, that provide much of its sunflower oil, that provide much of its fertilizer, is that Russia has blocked the ability to export essential food items, especially through the Black Sea ports. Russia has limited the ability to produce and distribute through bombing and missiles on Ukrainian infrastructure, severely damaging that country, as well as killing tens of thousands of civilians. And so the first question you asked is linked to the second. You have to get to a resolution of this through some type of negotiations, but I must be honest with you, and with Ms. Platonova, who's about to speak, the Kremlin does not want to negotiate. Even as we speak right now, Foreign Minister Lavrov has rebuffed the UN attempt to call for negotiations and for ceasefires The Russians are refusing to negotiate on the basis of a 15-page document given to them 3 weeks ago by Ukraine, talking about security guarantees for both countries. Until Vladimir Putin decides he does not want to try to take over at least part of Ukraine, we are going to have these effects on food, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Latin America, or whether it be in Pakistan, because supplies will be restricted.
Professor Lucas, I'm glad that you're talking about the need to end this crisis. But regardless of that, we have to actually look at the food inflation or food crisis independently as well. And we are talking about a situation where two countries together produce more than 30% of world's wheat and 20% of corn and 75 to 80% of sunflower oil. In that situation, even if you cannot control the conflict, should this matter not be addressed heads on? Because it is going to create humongous problem, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East and umpteen other places, as you pointed out, including Pakistan.
It is being addressed by many people. The UN World Food Program, for example, has warned that 75% of its supplies are threatened by this conflict. So the UN has been trying to get something done, including through the visit of Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General, to Moscow today. We've had attempts by a number of countries, so this isn't just a US versus Russia thing, by US, European countries, by Asian countries, to try to find ways of safeguarding at least some types of lines of supply that come out of Ukraine and out of Russia. Now, some of the lines of supply may be repaired because Russia has withdrawn from northern Ukraine. And so that means we may be able to export some agricultural products by rail to the west of the country. But the problem is that even though the Russian forces have been removed from northern Ukraine, they keep firing missiles on the rail lines to try to tear them up. And of course, they continue to blockade the ports. Yeah.
Professor Lucas, my concern is that when FAO itself buys 50% of grain from Russia and Ukraine, at that time, if these two places cannot provide that kind of supply, should we not actually be looking for any other kind of supply source? Because at this moment, this crisis is going to create even more pain around the world.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you look for other types of agricultural producing nations. You could talk about the Americans and Canada who are trying to increase supply. You can talk about other areas, for example, in the temperate regions of Europe that produce some supplies. But you've just answered your own question. You have an immediate 30% shortfall of wheat. You have an immediate shortfall of up to 75% of sunflower. So even as you try to diversify where you can get supplies from, that takes time. And right now, of course, we're only 2 months into an invasion, which, unless Vladimir Putin changes his mind, it could take more months or even years. So it takes us time to try to cover the damage that he's causing, even as we try to look at other areas that can increase their agricultural output, just as we look for other areas for energy supplies.
Yeah, Daria, 37% of the increase in the food prices, of course, all over Europe we're talking about, and of course Europe is getting hit by this. And if we look at Ukraine, of course humanitarian crisis is looming day by day. I just wanted to know, what about Russia? Russia itself would be facing the same situation right now because it is into a war. And I just wanted to know, wouldn't it be good for Russia as well to sit with the Ukraine and talk over and resolve the crisis rather than getting it increased day by day?
Of course, Russia was interested since the beginning of all the conversation and talks with the West to have a balance in the world, to have a respect for its own interests. And so Mr. Scott Lucas mentions that Russia is not now going into the conversation on peace talks. Now, Russia was for peace conversations. Now it's working with peace conversations. And the fact is that this is the West who didn't respect Russia's will, who didn't give the guarantees about the NATO invasion, I can say, of the countries, including Ukraine. This is exactly the geopolitical resistance of two blocks, of two civilizations, the globalist and the anti-globalist. And actually, the main factor of this crisis is that the anti-Russian sanctions destroy the other countries. For Russia, as you noted, actually, yes, there are there will be for sure also the effects of all this process and all this crisis, but
Right.
Russia fully ensures its own food security and safeguards its own
Right. But
interests.
Daria,
And
you were earlier saying
it
that
will, yes.
you were talking about Russia and how Russia is ready to agree to any kind of settlement. Of course, there is the statement by Foreign Minister Lavrov regarding the process, which actually calls everything into question. Is it not true?
I think that the main problem now with the humanitarian crisis and with the crisis of the supplies is has the problem. It was caused by the anti-Russian sanctions because the West started to blockage the ships, and they actually these are the problems. The West
Daria,
tries to
Daria,
forcibly
so what
trade.
essentially,
Yes.
Ms. Daria, essentially what you're saying is that the sanctions on Russia is what is causing this entire problem.
Yes, exactly. And even European Union and Mr. Joseph Borrell, when he was discussing the a new pocket of the sanctions, the new chain of sanctions against Russia, was noticing that the sanctions are not fully stopping Russia from the process of demilitarization and denazification. And actually, the thing is that they hurt Europe itself. As we see now, for example, in France, the anti-Russian sanctions caused the massive inflation and the problem with the bread, with also the fertilizers for growing food. So there is a problem that these sanctions
Yeah.
they destroy Europe, they destroy the other world, and
Right,
Africa. This is now
Daria,
in the
I
center of
don't want to
crisis.
actually go
Yes.
into a chicken and egg, debate about what actually caused what. My question at this moment is, if the sanctions are really hurting, is it not true that cessation of hostilities and withdrawal or end to this special operation oblique invasion will actually resolve those problems as well, and gradually those sanctions will be lifted as well?
You mean in Russia? Does it provoke the problems in Russia inside in the economy of Russian sector?
Yeah, but if Russia wants to improve these things, it can actually stop the invasion or operation, and then things will start looking up.
But the problem is the defending of our geopolitical interest and our sovereignty, because we were ready for the talks and we were holding talks with NATO. We were trying to have them, but it seems that NATO nor Ukraine was not interested in having a peace. So when we have seen the process of the Nazification of the Ukraine, the problem when there the Nazi elements were doing the genocide of Russians in the eastern Ukraine, then the situation is changing. Russia is defending
All right,
its
Daria.
people. Russia is defending.
Nazis actually did, hang on. Nazis actually perpetrated genocide in Mariupol?
Nazi are now trying to stay till the end in the Azovstal, and Russia proposed millions and thousands of times for them to have a humanitarian corridor to leave the Azovstal. And according to also the statements of Denis Pushilin, the representative of Donetsk People's Republic, there are 400
All right,
mercenaries
Daria,
from the
Daria,
West
what
who
I
are
want to
participating,
understand, what I
and
want to
there are
understand with regards to the food crisis and what's happening globally is whatever is happening right now, what would Russia propose to be the solution of what's going on? What would Russia want to do? I understand what you're saying is that militarization or its invasion of Ukraine, or that the actions that have been conducted in the past with reference to Ukraine are part of your geopolitical interests, what you're saying, and you're also saying that sanctions need to be lifted as a result of that and are not really a deterrence to you. I get all of that, but what I want to understand is, if all of this is true for Russia, what does Russia want to be able to do with reference to the food crisis, or does it not care?
It cares about its partners. So if we speak about Africa, then it's now creating the logistics of delivering the food independently from the sanctions, which will be not installed on the routes which are covered by the sanctions. So actually, Russia is open to help its friends, and it will do it. But the problem is that the sanctions, the problem with the sanctions, and with the problem with this food crisis, it is caused not because of Russia, but it's caused because of the Western actually policy of this with the sanctions policy. So the problem is that
All right,
the
Daria.
sanctions
Yes. Professor Scott,
somehow.
Professor Scott,
Russia-
looking at the ground realities, of course, we know that Russian forces, they have full control of Donbass, Donetsk, and then Mariupol as well right now. And looking at the food crisis which is being faced by the world, and of course the whole world is concerned about it, to you, what would be the best solution which can be accepted to the Western countries as well as Russia as well, and knowing the fact that Russia wants the sanctions to be lifted?
Well, again, the best solution is right there, and that is Russia stops the invasion and occupation. But when Daria Platonova, and I know her academic record well, it's a good academic record, but when she's reduced to being effectively a Kremlin mouthpiece and won't address the questions,
let
just
us not
trot
take
out.
it.
You are NATO mouthpiece, sorry. You are NATO mouthpiece, or maybe official representative.
No, sorry. Again, when you again, sorry.
Let's don't
I'm
get
speaking.
personal.
I need to address, for example,
please.
I need to address that when someone comes on and says that there's a genocide against Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine to justify Russia,
there was.
which is untrue, and she knows it's untrue, then we despair of getting a solution. So what can be done? It is possible
Mr.
right now.
Lucas, I have
It is
my friend
possible.
who was.
Sorry, I'm answering. I'm answering. It is
Daria, I'll
possible.
come back
I'm
to you.
sorry. I'm
Daria,
answering.
let him finish and I'll come back to
Daria,
you.
you'll be given time. Daria, you'll be given time.
Donbass. By enough,
So-
and this was done with
Yeah, so
the
you-
respect of the West.
So you can continue the disinformation in a minute. Let me continue. If Vladimir Putin right now would accept the fact
Thank you.
that he controls part of Eastern Ukraine, if he would accept that he controls part of Southern Ukraine, that he occupies it, he could go into talks right now. He could go into talks and spare lives. The problem is, as again we heard in the last few hours, is that the Russians have rejected any negotiations either directly with Ukraine on the basis of the 15-page plan for a resolution or through a mediator. So what do? What you have to do is work with the rest of Ukraine to try to get food production out of the area that is unoccupied. You have to work with other areas of the world which do have agricultural production. You have to work with countries like Pakistan to say, how do we maintain the lines of supply? Because you maintain the lines of supply and then you hope to get the space that once the Russians are unable to proceed further militarily, then we can go into talks. But it will take time.
Dr.
and it's a question-
Lucas, that is a good idea. That is actually a great idea. I asked this, I actually mentioned this because it takes me back to another international conflict, that is the First World War. The way things have been actually unfolding for past many months, it reminds you of a war that could have been avoided very easily, unlike the Second World War where Nazis actually had taken over a substantial part of Europe and they were invading elsewhere. But in the First World War, similar kind of miscalculations actually got prolonged and they destroyed an entire generation. It seems that even now, these beasts that we are unlocking, these monsters like food shortage all over the world might actually contribute to a bigger conflict in coming days, and it might create so many problems. Is it not important at this moment for all countries to come together and try to resolve their differences regardless of blame game? Because at this moment, if you don't do it, Ukraine is one place where this is going on. It is sad, but it could expand to all over the world, sir.
Absolutely. I mean, let's put this in a wider context. We as an international community through 2020, 2021 faced the pandemic. And we faced the question of, as millions of lives were lost, how could we work together to mitigate that damage? Now, personally, I don't think enough was done to help parts of the world escape from coronavirus. I think more could have been done with vaccines, for example. But we are in a better position now than we were last year at this time. Now we have a different type of crisis. We have a man-made crisis because one country decided to invade another one and created all types of excuses: denazification, demilitarization. All right, let's do two things. One, let's cut through those sham excuses. It's not a question of Nazis controlling Ukraine. It's not a question that there's a genocide against Russian speakers. It's not even a question that Ukraine was going to be a member of NATO. Once we clear through that, then go back to Moscow and say, okay, what do security guarantees mean for you as well as Kyiv? That was what was on the table in January and February up to February 24th, that talks were being offered to Vladimir Putin on the basis of security guarantees for the region, but that was not what he wanted at that time. Let's hope that his mind can be changed, if not today, then within a few
All right.
months.
Daria,
Professor Scott,
Daria,
we'll
would
come
you
back
like
to
respond?
Daria and respond to that.
Yeah.
Yes, first of all, I would like to say that I'm not a Kremlin mouthpiece, and I represent the patriotic view from myself, and I'm independent journalist, and I'm independent political analyst. So the story of the Donbass in the thing, how I perceive that, it's not the facts of the propaganda, it's my personal experience. I was looking on the region from 2014. I had my friend who was who died there, and I have really personal impact on the Russians, which was suffering there. And I invite personally Scott Lucas to go to Donetsk. I will organize for him a special trip there for just to have a look on what is going on, because I really think that he underestimates all the conflict. The problem is that Russia was till the end on the side of talks. And it's so strange that NATO, that the Western countries was so ignorant about the talks process. And actually, because of this, the blood is on the hands of the West. The crisis, the food crisis is on the hands of the West. The only thing I can agree with this, with Professor Scott, is that Scott Lucas, is that the crisis actually began long before Russian special military operation in Ukraine. Yes, we had really seen the disruption of the global trade routes due to the COVID crisis, negative consequences hitting all the sectors of the world's economy, including agricultural producers. And I think now, actually, this my point of view is that this anti-Russia sanctions, if you want to stop our operation, the operation of Russia, it will not stop it because we are now defending our geopolitical values, and this is just killing
all right,
the
Daria,
other
I
parts of
understand
the
that.
world.
And I understand that. Professor Scott, earlier we were talking about the larger global context in which the food crisis actually exists, and the way perhaps the international community must get together. But again, this is perhaps fairly recent, and I understand the impact that the Ukraine crisis has had on the food crisis. But we've had issues with food supplies and issues with the way that food is distributed around the world, even prior to this crisis as well. We've had organizations such as the UN and the Food and Agriculture Authority existing for a long time now. Yet, despite that, we have issues with the way that this crisis is dealt around the world. Isn't there perhaps, it seems to be that perhaps the mechanisms or the platforms that even currently exist are not really fulfilling their role, or perhaps need to be revamped in a way that the crisis is actually averted, because there wasn't much being done in terms of dealing with those issues before this as well.
And especially when you're looking at this fact that 50% of grain is bought from Ukraine, that actually frightens you, that so many eggs being placed in a single bucket, that shows lack of preparedness, that there should be contingency plans as well.
Now, I mean, we've been here before in the sense of, remember the 1970s when we talked about the green revolution and the idea of agricultural production being spurred around the world? There are a number of issues where we need a separate hour to talk about where the way that we have a free market economy can get in the way of ensuring that you get the right distribution of agricultural products around the world. But that said, we had gotten to the point where you do have areas, well, take the World Food Program for existence, to try to make sure that those who are in need around the world are supplied. But then we had the shock of what happened after 2011, for example, in the Middle East, which significantly affected, continues to affect food supply. And so the World Food Program was being overstretched with trying to provide supplies there. Then we've had the problems of climate change in recent years that have led to serious droughts in parts of Africa, across Asia, indeed across the world. Then we had the pandemic.
Will you allow me, Professor, to
actually
add to this list? Will you allow me to add to this list? I give you two more. Ukraine has been demanding that it needs $7 billion per month. And then that is not all. While this crisis is going on, we see that Elon Musk has spent $46 billion to buy Twitter. I mean,
Yeah,
there's so much wealth in the West, but it goes in other direction.
yeah, and let's put it this way: I'd love to see Elon Musk put 44 billion into getting food supplies around the
Yeah,
world rather
yeah.
than getting his own personal political platform. But that's another program. The fundamental that you talk about here is you just hit the nail on the head. The reason why Ukraine needs $7 billion per month is because it's being damaged to the tens of billions of dollars per month by the Russian invasion. Indeed, we're talking more than $100 billion of damage that have taken place so far. So, if you want to have an immediate effect on this, again, the answer is right there before us. You have an end to occupation. You have immediate ceasefires right now. You have talks between the two parties where both Russia and Ukraine can begin to resume export. And if Russia really wants the sanctions to be lifted on it, why were the sanctions put on in the first place? They were put on because of Russian attacks, Russian aggression. So, easy solution: stop invading your neighbor, and the world will benefit.
Professor Scott, you earlier talked about, obviously, if we are facing these food shortages, the alternate destinations we need to look for. And you mentioned Pakistan. About Pakistan, we already know that, of course, Pakistan is an agricultural country, but it lacks the up-to-date technologies that can enhance its production, agriculture production. And of course, that technology is with the West. Will the West
No.
would be sharing that tech with Pakistan so that Pakistan can fulfill all of these ambitions?
Supply and demand, by the way.
Yeah, 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 again, and look, it's interesting that I come back to this and say the way that the market has been set up for centuries for distributing food has always favored some rather than others. But Pakistan has an opportunity now in that we have a world where there's much more diversity, potential diversity in terms of supply. For that diversity of supply to take place, Pakistan has to think, no, we don't just rely on the United States, we don't just rely on Europe. And conversely, we need US and European countries to realize that when you have a China, for example, when you potentially have Russia and Ukraine, if you get out of the conflict, that could have a significant effect on the market, we need to think about a more even type of market with more players in the game. Can I tell you that'll change overnight, given the fact that you have many large centralized agricultural producers, especially in the US? No. But I think it's something of always realizing this isn't a West versus East question. Look for multiple sources in terms of where you can get that technology.
Right. Right. Daria, I want you to help us understand certain things, right? And you can be of great help. At this moment, most of us, particularly me, we consume most of the Western media. I do see RT as well, but most of the information that we get is coming from Western sources. At this moment, the picture that is painted is of President Putin not listening to anybody any longer. So the question at this moment is, we have seen Macron actually, intervening earlier, and he had some talks. And then we saw the German Chancellor also talking to President Putin. But do you think that in this atmospherics, there are countries or individuals that might be able to work as bridges? Because at this moment, the crisis is bigger than Ukraine. The crisis is even bigger than Russia. And it is humanitarian and it can become really horrible. Is it not important for some people to actually communicate with President Putin and find a solution?
Yes, thank you a lot for the question. It's very important about, you mentioned that the crisis is not only in the Ukraine, it's not concerning only Ukraine, it's concerning all the world. And this is not only the economical sanctions and the, economical crisis about which we were speaking during today's debates, but it's only the geopolitical crisis, because this is the end of the unipolar system, and it shows that there are much more than one civilization in the world. It's not a globalist civilization, but there exists Chinese, there exists Islamic civilization, if we follow Samuel Huntington's division, African civilizations. And actually what we can see now, you noted correctly that, for example, Macron and Scholz talks are not giving something positive. First of all, because even Macron was using the Putin's card for his elections. He was trying to gain the popularity with these 5 hour talks, and he was coming to Kiev, and then after these 5 hour talks with Putin, before the launch of the special military operation, he said that he convinced Putin not to go on Ukraine. And actually, but we see that very effective as the collaboration with China and now the talks. We see the growing role of Pakistan, which is also important. It was much more clear with Imran
All
Khan now
right.
with the
All right,
political
Daria,
crisis
unfortunately,
in
that's all we have
Pakistan.
time for. Thank you very much, Daria Platinova, for
Thank you.
joining us, and Professor Scott Lutis for being a
you very
part of
much.
the show. When we look at the situation, also with reference to Pakistan and China's relations as well, there has been talk about how there is going to be a renewed commitment towards a relationship with China under the new leadership and the new government. And this is, of course, something that has been talked about with particular reference to CPEC as well. So in our next segment, we'll take a look at what is going to change and what sort of impact the new government is going to have on the way the relationship moves forward. And then, of course, with particular reference to CPEC, how are the projects going to move forward as well? Farrukh, the CPEC has obviously been a very huge project for Pakistan. There has been a lot of talk about how many economic gains are going to be there for Pakistan with reference to CPEC, but unfortunately, it hasn't been as fast-tracked as we had hoped for, something that the new government also promises to go ahead with. Do you think that the kind of concerns or issues that we had in the process and in the delays that we have seen before in the CPEC will change now moving forward?
Right, Sana, first of all, let me congratulate you on a great segue. I mean, Daria just mentioned China and you took it away and you took it to CPEC. I should compliment you on that. But regarding CPEC, you see, 1 year ago, I think I was interviewed by NPR or one of these international media organizations, and I was asked to comment on the situation in which CPEC actually came to Pakistan. If you remember those days when Pakistan was going through war on terror and everything, every inch was covered by terrorist attacks, right? At that time, nobody, no investor wanted to come here, and our Chinese brethren actually came here and they invested. And I told the interviewer that actually won, even though our relationship was very close even then, but that won all our hearts and minds, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that is a project which Pakistan attaches great importance to, although there has been politics in the past before the previous government when PMLN was in power. At that time, there was a lot of debate because of PTI, People's Party elsewhere, about the routes that might be built, right? Corridors, what province will be, included, which will not be. And then later on, then we saw CPEC authority. At this moment also, there are many concerns regarding, as you pointed out, law and order situation,
Right.
umpteen others, and then India keeps on lobbying against the project. But I can assure you of one thing, it never stalled, it will never stall, it will actually speed up. That is not because of the partisan reasons. Our political parties might fight among themselves, but when they come into power, they are sure about one thing, that CPEC and China is a relationship that we cannot lose, and that's why we will double down. Even during the previous government, I thought that the previous government was putting in a lot of effort, right? And that was there. Yes, you wanted to actually say
Right.
something.
I just wanted to also include in the conversation Mr. Shakil Ahmed, who's a senior analyst, and he has joined us online as well. And I also want to talk to him with reference to CPEC and the way things are going to move forward. We're talking about how perhaps the government or the party that's in power is irrelevant to the way that we're going to see CPEC proceed and the relationship between Pakistan and China evolve in the future as well. Would you say the same? And do you think that perhaps when we look at, in particular, the CPEC projects as well, perhaps the new leadership is going to take it forward, because they've been talking about how previously it wasn't done in the manner that they would have done it, or there were delays that cannot be afforded, or there were political reasons behind why that happened. Do you think that this leadership is going to change the way we're going to see CPEC projects move up?
Described in your question. First of all, so I want to make it clear here, China does not have any preference for any political party. So they work with every political party and institution of Pakistan. They have the relationship with Pakistan. Second, if we have to compare the past performance of PMLN to the present need, we have to make a distinction. In the past, all projects are mostly, or we can say the mostly projects, they were G2G, government to government, or B2G, business to the government. And they were very straightforward in the terms where then the investment was coming in the energy and the infrastructure sectors. But second phase is more complicated because we are talking about industrial cooperation and we are talking about agriculture cooperation, and there is a MOU on the science and technology, so and also tourism. So if we look at industry especially, so there are so many institutions which are involved in establishing and running the industry. For example, if you have to establish a company, you have to deal number of government institutions. For the taxation, you have to deal with the 35 tax agencies in the Pakistan, and top on that, so the some provinces have their own preferences for the tax policies, and they are different from one province to another province. So second phase is quite complicated. And for that purpose, if PMLN have to want to make a progress, they have to create mechanisms which can eliminate this complication, and they can smoothen the process for the implementation. And also they can consolidate work under one authority like the CPEC authority. So they need a CPEC authority more this time as compared to the first phase of the CPEC.
Right, but the planning minister has spoken about how the CPEC authority should be abolished and in fact was a redundant organization.
And by the
No,
way,
it
does it not actually, sorry, Shakil, just wanted to know, even when it existed, was it not under the purview of planning ministry? Because planning minister used to actually, the last CPEC authority chair was appointed with the consultation of Asad Umar.
Yes, so and he was also working with he was special assistant Mr. Khalid Mansoor, and the chair before him, the chairman of CPEC Authority, General Assam Bajwa, he was reporting also to the CPEC minister. The problem is not the CPEC Authority. Problem is the powers of the CPEC Authority. If you look at the ordinance, it seems like it is only the coordination agency or the facilitation agency. But what I am talking about, the CPEC Authority that must have the power to take a decision and implement, because there is a very much rational to create a CPEC authority. If we can compare the special economic zones process of India with the China, India started the process even before the China. But look at Chinese economy now and the economy of India. Indians, they have the same processes or something like that, so which are more complicated, involve so many institutions and
Yeah,
complications.
that
Like
was a very good point, and totally get it that there should be one window operation instead of actually going to 36 authorities, and I think that is a good point. But this accusation somehow by this government or the previous parties that CPEC slowed down under one leadership or there were circumstances. Is it not true that because of COVID, a lot of things changed, and that's why the entire BRI project all over the world slowed down? It had nothing to do with Pakistan.
if you look at the global system, so where the FDI and investment across the world, not only for the BRI but generally, so there was, I think, the 40% decrease in the global foreign direct investment in the first 2 years of COVID-19. One thing, and second thing, there was a lag between first phase and the second phase. Because why there was a lag? Because if during the first phase we have to produce a special economic zone policy, and we have to set up the special economic zone at least for half of the work, which we did not. That's why there was something of a lag. But there was no compromise on the ongoing projects and looking in ways to include the new areas. For example, during last visit of the President RF Alvi, I think in 2020, when he went to the China after the COVID-19, he was the first leader. So Pakistan signed two new MOUs, one MOU on agriculture cooperation and another MOU on the science and technology. But the real thing is that, Farrukh, if we want to implement it with the spirit, we have to consolidate the work. And
Right.
like, no, look at
And
that.
I'm
One,
glad.
one
Hang
thing,
on, hang on, hang on,
one
hang
thing.
on, hang on. Allow me to ask you, just invert your question or your own argument. You keep on talking about the need to actually centralize and streamline the processes. I totally agree. But because you gave an analogy of two countries, India and China, what occurs to me is that in China, while the political system might be centralized, when you look at development authorities, they are devolved, and local governments actually take care of most of the stewardship of these projects. shouldn't there be, a CPEC authority, one window operation for each special economic zone?
Look, Farrukh, you gave the example of the local authority. We have to study the system because local authority follow the policy guidelines which have been given, and there is no if and buts. They follow the policy guidelines with the true spirit, and nobody can question, oh, this policy should be like that, this should be like that. They are following the policy guidelines which has been given to each provincial in the local government. They can make a decision on the efficiency basis, how they can make it more efficient, or they can make a more pro people. But the system have to run. There should not be like that. This is like that happening. This one, I'm not agreeing this clause, or I'm not agreeing this clause. One thing, and second thing, there is no difference of the government. There is a one government. Here in the provinces, you find different governments. Even in the one province, you find the different people, different parties who are ruling the districts for the local governments. So there's a
Right.
difference in that.
All right, Mr. Shakil, there's also a concern of the law and order situation as well, something that was an issue in the previous government as well. But even if we take away the involvement of the leadership or the political parties and their impact, the issue of law and order and the threat that exists from different terrorist organizations has been there and currently also exists. And there has been a spike in terrorist activities in the country as well. And we've also seen the attack on Chinese nationals in Karachi, which of course means that perhaps these concerns are there, and Chinese concerns with reference to CPEC projects and their security also exist. How will Pakistan or the new government be able to deal with that or provide assurances to the Chinese government with reference to CPEC projects being safe and their citizens being safe?
I think that is a very valid question. The first thing which I always argue, even after Dasu attack, I also wrote an article on this. There is a need to redefine and relook at our security infrastructure for the second phase of CPEC. Because during the first phase, their work was not so much scattered. And second thing which we urge us to relook at our security framework, that is the fifth generation warfare. We have to also have to include those elements which can contribute for this one. Third thing, which we also have to include in the new security framework, we should not only concentrate on enemies, we also have to look at the rival friends who are in the immediate neighborhood of us, who also have their own preferences, and they want to attract the investment towards them. So we have to relook at our security framework to make sure that no security threat is emerging. If we are only concentrating on our enemies.
What does that mean? Hang on. What does that mean?
Are you pointing towards Iran?
No, the basic country that he must be pointing towards is India, basically. Number one is India. Iran, since we had Chabahar twinning with our own port, I don't think Iran is that much a big issue. But regardless, what do you mean by looking again at our security strategy? How can we change that? Because these issues have been around for quite some time, and all we have done is fight terrorists.
Look, right now, our more concentration is on the manned security. So we are providing number of people and whatnot. But we also have to go invisible security. So where we can figure out from where the security threats are emerging, which is a rule happening in the world. But our more concentration is on the visible security, one thing. And second thing, we also have to keep in mind the fifth generation warfare, when I'm saying again and again. Because look at that, the latest blast which happened in Karachi today, she is the mother of two children. But somebody has worked with her to radicalize her. And from where it is coming. So one element we have to look at that.
That's a good point. Thank you very much, Mr. Shakil, for joining us. We're unfortunately out of time. That's all we have time for. We'll see you tomorrow with more news around the world and what's going on. Thank you very much for watching the debate.